you ever wonder why you don't see more products with Microsoft Teams integrations? As of 2025, Microsoft Teams likely has over 300 million monthly active users. The best estimates I could find for Slack are around 60 million monthly active users. And that's a massive size difference. But when you look at things like Stack Overflow threads, where there are more questions than answers or views, and questions are split across multiple product tags, it just doesn't look like that many people are building things on top of Microsoft Teams. Stay tuned as I chat with one of our product engineers about their experience building a feature that helps simplify Teams integrations, and then learn about some of the challenges you might face when building a Teams integration from scratch. What's up, folks? Jeff Everhart here. I am a developer advocate with Knock, and I'm joined today by Matt Mikolay, who is a product engineer at Knock. And we're here to discuss a new feature that Matt's been working on for the last couple of months that I think will help a lot of people create Microsoft Teams integrations. So Matt, I think this is actually the first time we've had a public discussion like this. So you want to kind of give us an introduction?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah. So my name is Matt, as you said. I'm a software engineer here on the product team at Knock. As such, I work full stack. In our backend, I'm doing Elixir, contributing to our dashboard in TypeScript and React, and also making a bunch of contributions to our JavaScript SDKs.
Yes. And Matt has been very busy since he started at Knock, just a couple months ago, right?
Yeah, that's right. So let's see. I think October was when I got started.
Yeah. Okay. So not long at all, but already sort of shipping your first like really big feature project. And I've already alluded to the fact that has to do with Microsoft Teams, but do you want to kind of describe for us what this feature is in kind of your own words and what problems it might solve for Knock users?
Sure thing. So what we're launching is a set of React components, hooks, and APIs that we're calling TeamsKit. Now, our goal here is, just as Knock's SlackKit simplified the process of creating a Slack bot, TeamsKit should simplify the process of creating a Microsoft Teams bot. Today, TeamsKit offers two different React components. The first one is MS Teams auth button, which is used to manage the Microsoft OAuth 2.0 flow, where a Teams admin can approve permissions on behalf of your Microsoft Teams bot. And the other React component is called MS Teams Channel Combo Box. And this is used once a Microsoft Entra tenant has already been connected to Knock to simplify connecting Microsoft Teams channels to Knock objects so that they can easily receive notifications in Microsoft Teams.
Okay, awesome. So I always like to dig into like the background on certain features and like why we decide to release them. And I guess this is sort of similar, right? Because we also have, like you mentioned, a SlackKit set of components that does something very similar for Slack. Obviously, this now sort of solves that problem for Teams. But like, what are some of the differences between the two? Like, I know you've worked a little bit in SlackKit already, but if you could kind of elaborate on what you think the differences between those are, and like, what problems is this trying to solve for users? How did we know it was a problem? Why did we decide to prioritize it now?
Right. So I think the problem really boils down to, it almost sounds silly to say it, but like building a Microsoft Teams bot is a hard problem.
Yeah.
If you want to build a Slack bot, you can go easily spin up a test workspace in Slack. There's a lot of really comprehensive docs that cover building a Slack bot. But if you decide to build a Microsoft Teams bot, it's a little bit like, how do I start? And certainly here at Knock, we've had customers approach us who have already built Slack bots, and they're like, yeah, I want to build a Microsoft Teams bot. What do I do? So that kind of demonstrates like how challenging it is to get started.
And just to kind of clarify and give some background, right? It's been possible for a long time to like use Teams as a channel in Knock. It's just that like the plumbing of getting some of those authentication tokens and stuff like that was more manual, and really the onus of that was put on the developer, like the end user developer, where that's sort of where TeamsKit comes in. Awesome. So how did you approach this from a technical point of view? Like, what different avenues did you look at when trying to solve the problem? What I don't know, like maybe what was challenging about this?
Yeah, so there were a couple of different things I did to really dig deep on Microsoft Teams and try to understand how to architect TeamsKit. The first thing I did was just really dive deep on understanding how Microsoft Teams bots are built.
Okay.
I myself, prior to TeamsKit, have never had any experience using Microsoft Teams. So I was totally new to this. So it was a lot of digging deep in the Microsoft API docs and learning about the data model in Teams. Microsoft also provides a VS Code extension called Teams Toolkit.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
yes, yeah, unrelated to knock TeamsKit, it's called Teams
Okay.
Toolkit.
Okay. Okay.
But it was super helpful in getting like a basic Microsoft Teams bot up and running and really simplified that. It does everything in JavaScript. Um, and yeah, once I really understood how a Microsoft Teams bot is built, then I moved on to kind of understanding how we might architect things similar to SlackKit, but taking
Okay.
into consideration how Teams is just an entirely different domain.
Yeah, because that was definitely one of my questions here was like, what are the differences in the data models between something like Slack and Teams? Does it map nicely? Are there places where there's mostly overlap but some differences, or just totally different?
Yeah. So the first thing is that like Slack and Microsoft Teams both have channels in which conversations occur.
Okay.
But I think the biggest difference is that whereas Slack has channels, a Microsoft Teams organization has teams, and those teams themselves have channels. So there's one additional layer of hierarchy
Okay.
there.
Okay.
Obviously, this had implications on the UI for TeamsKit. So if you look at our MS Teams channel combo box, there's basically two drop-down menus, one to choose your team and one to choose your channel within your chosen team.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's also had implications on the channel data
I was
that we
gonna
actually
say, yep.
store in the knock channel. So like the
Okay.
information about the team and the channel stored on a knock object.
So on the team side, we have basically like a tenant. Then inside of that tenant, we have teams, and inside of those teams, we have channels. Whereas with Slack, it seems like it's just like a workspace, which might map to a tenant, and then inside of that, we would have additional channels. So interesting, yeah. And like you said, that had implications for the way that we designed the combo box and the channel data. What was the experience like for you as a developer, like browsing the docs, getting a testing environment stood up? What was that different, similar, more difficult with Teams, more difficult with Slack?
Yeah, it was definitely more difficult with teams. As I kind of said earlier, like in Slack, you can kind of like click a couple buttons and get a test workspace set up and running. There's a lot of clear docs, but Microsoft, in comparison, Microsoft has ended general public access to the Office 365 developer program,
Okay.
which means it's really hard for just a random person to get a test tenant set up in Microsoft Teams.
Oh,
Um,
really?
Yes. So we at
Interesting.
Knock developed this in our own Microsoft Teams tenant that we use at Knock for a couple of other different things. But that's one difficulty I encountered. And
Okay.
then, yeah, so like from there, once we had the test tenant set up, I really kind of leaned on that VS Code extension I mentioned before called Teams Toolkit. That simplifies a lot of the like complexity of getting like the scaffolding set up for Microsoft
Mm-hmm.
Teams bot and everything. Yeah, and then something else that kind of comes to mind is like when you're building a Microsoft Teams bot in particular, you kind of have to do what I call like the two API tango, where there's two different Microsoft APIs to use here. So the first one is called the
Oh,
Bot Framework
interesting.
API. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So the Bot Framework API is used to actually send notifications, send messages as a Microsoft Teams bot. But if you want to retrieve a list of teams or a list of channels on behalf of a Microsoft Entra tenant, you need to use a
Mm-hmm.
different API called the Microsoft Graph API.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And that
So
seems very different from the way that Slack works, where it's just you have sort of this singular API that you can use to get data about a workspace or send those messages. Okay, so yeah, let me stop and unpack something there because I have kind of a question. So you mentioned the bot framework for Microsoft Teams. Is that similar to the Bolt framework that Slack has for like building backends for bots, or is that something kind of different?
it's kind of different. My understanding, having worked briefly using Slack's Bolt in the past, is like you can build your entire Slack bot using Bolt.
Okay.
And certainly you can use the bot framework to build an entire Microsoft Teams bot, but it depends upon where you want to go from there. If you want to basically provide an experience in your product, your SaaS product, that allows your end user to choose which Microsoft Teams channel they want to connect that bot to, that kind of thing. Then you're going to need to start getting into the Microsoft Graph API. So there's like the division between the two different APIs here is like the Microsoft Bot Framework's responsible for the bot itself, like receiving messages, sending messages, replying, and the Graph API is kind of everything else. Like that takes care of like getting information about teams, the Microsoft Entra tenant, the channels within those teams, that sort of thing. And
so if you want to build a self-serve experience, there's no way around what you said, like the two API tango.
It depends upon how you build it, but like if you want to go the direction of not offering that kind of like channel picker experience, which by the way, the new MS Teams channel combo box and TeamsKit simplifies that for you.
Yeah.
But if you want to provide that type of thing, I'm pretty sure you're going to have to venture into the Microsoft Graph API.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. And I would think most products, at least most of the integrations that we see, would need something like that where, hey, I want to direct this message to this particular location. So that's super interesting. And did we touch on the docs at all? What was that experience like? I mean, obviously now if you're dealing with two separate APIs, you're dealing with two separate sets of documentation. Did you run into any issues there?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, the Microsoft docs are just very hard to follow and very, very deep. It's also made difficult by the fact that a lot of the concepts in Microsoft Teams and Microsoft bots have changed names over time. So you'll see things like Microsoft Entra tenant is maybe also called an organization, and like what's, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, the like parsing and understanding the docs was definitely challenging.
Well, now that I understand that there's two separate APIs, like those could be two totally separate teams, creating the documentation for each sort of part of that experience. That's crazy. That's a new nugget that I did not understand when we approached this project.
Right. And so that leads me to like, often in software engineering, if you encounter an issue, your first thing is to Google search for that same issue. And like often you'll find like a Stack Overflow thread or something of someone with that same issue. Mm-hmm. A challenge that I felt I encountered regularly is that like I would encounter a specific problem with like an API or something, Google with that issue and find a thread in a forum or Stack Overflow, whatever it may be, with someone having the same exact issue. But the response is one of two things. It's either someone from basically Microsoft customer support saying like, oh, I'll help you solve this issue. And then they don't really effectively solve it in the end. Or someone like the other scenario I see is that it's someone from a Microsoft team saying, oh, like this actually doesn't belong to my team. This is the bot framework team, or it's the Microsoft Graph team saying.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and then they try to punt it to someone else's backlog. So like it feels like a lot of those issues never actually get solved.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, and I mean, just from the developer's perspective, having a single API surface to work against versus two is a totally different ballgame, or dance floor, using your metaphor. So that's that. Yeah. And that's all really great stuff. So let's talk more about like the technical challenges of this. We talked a little bit about the data model and the differences there. But was there any like technical challenge that you had to face as a part of building this feature, and how did you approach it? I know maybe we did some interesting stuff with token management, and again, might be a place where the way Microsoft handles this differs from the way Slack handles this.
Exactly. So yeah, token management is exactly it. Again, we're using two different APIs here, but if you look at the Slack API and what we did in SlackKit, we have OAuth access tokens that don't need to be refreshed if you're using SlackKit. Don't need to be refreshed, excuse me. In comparison with the Microsoft Graph API, access tokens always need to be refreshed regularly. So what that means is we couldn't store the access token on the channel data, NOC channel data itself.
Okay.
Or rather, we could have, but that would require us to constantly update NOC channel data, which is just not efficient.
Okay.
So instead, what we did is we decided to cache the access tokens, and instead we're storing the Microsoft Entra tenant ID on a NOC tenant.
Okay.
And then we use that to look up in our cache, the cached access token. We'll refresh it automatically if it's expired and needs refreshing.
Oh, awesome.
And all of that complexity is just handled automatically if you use the new MS Teams auth button within TeamsKit.
Okay. So that seems like another great reason to use that, because I can imagine the amount of code you would have to write on your own to like deal with that in a reasonable way would just get kind of painful. And again, like that makes me think a lot about how we handled, I don't know, expired tokens for like push. There was a feature we released not long ago that simplified a lot of that there, so that if you had expired tokens, Knock would sort of like remove them automatically for you. And so I think it just, anything that can help you manage your tokens, right, helps
Right.
you write custom code, or saves you from writing custom code. That's really interesting. So like obviously I know we have the Slack kit set of components. Some of that sort of maps to what we did in TeamsKit, but did we look for inspiration anywhere else as we approach developing TeamsKit?
Yes. So one thing I did is kind of dig into existing SaaS products that kind of offer some sort of
Okay.
Microsoft Teams integration from the start. And I was mainly looking to see how they guide admin users, Teams admins, through the process of setting up a Microsoft Teams bot, and how they might actually leverage those Microsoft APIs that I discussed. Um, I try to think of one specific one I referenced, Vanta. I know Vanta
Okay.
provides a Microsoft Teams integration. I remember poking around in the Vanta dashboard to
Mm-hmm.
see how they actually go through the process of connecting a Microsoft Teams organization to a Vanta tenant, I guess you would call it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Cool. Do you think we could do a quick demo so we can show people kind of what it is that we've been talking about for the last 15 or so minutes?
Yeah, for sure. Let me see if I can just share my screen here. All right, so what I
Okay.
have here is a very simple example app using the two different components of TeamsKit.
Awesome.
On the right, you'll see MS Teams auth button. You can style
Okay.
it within a container like this. And
Yep.
on the left, you'll see the channel picker. Now, I actually want to reset this real quick because you'll see we are already showing as connected.
Yep.
So I want to do kind of like an end-to-end walkthrough as if
Okay.
the Microsoft Teams tenant has not yet been connected. So I'll click that. And if I go to my Knock dashboard, I'm looking at a tenant here named the Knock MS Teams tenant. You'll see that there's no channel data for this tenant. We go back to the example app, where an end user would actually start is with this MS Teams auth button here. They would click connect to Microsoft Teams, and then they'd be prompted with the Microsoft OAuth 2.0 flow. So
Okay.
we're again imagining that I'm a Microsoft Teams admin here, so I have permission to do this. I'll click my account, and then it'll basically ask for my permission to authorize the application. I'll click accept, and then you'll see that we are showing as connected.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
If I
Cool.
go back to the Knock tenant here and refresh, you'll see that I now have my Microsoft Teams tenant ID there. That means my Knock tenant has been connected to my Microsoft Entra tenant. So from here, now you'll see that the MS Teams channel picker has transitioned to an enabled state. And what that means is I can view the different lists of teams within my Microsoft Entra tenant. I can go from here and choose the different channels that I would like to
Okay.
connect to my Knock object. And if I go back to the Knock dashboard and click the object that I'm using here, you'll see that under chat connections, we have all this different data about the different teams the different channels and teams that have been connected here. So these are the two different components of TeamsKit, and kind of just simplifies end to end,
Yeah.
connecting a Microsoft Entra tenant to a Knock tenant and connecting a Knock object to different channels within an Entra tenant.
Yep. And then from there, right, we would just trigger a workflow using that object as a recipient. And then that's going to send a message to kind of all of the channels that appear in that channel data array, right?
Correct.
Yep. And I guess one thing to call out here, and like a design pattern that I think applies to both SlackKit and TeamsKit, because you mentioned at the beginning, like I'm pretending that I'm a Teams admin. And so I think one of the things to call out is like the idea behind these integrations, right, is that they're sort of like at the organizational level, right? This isn't something you would expose to every end user, and it might be behind like an admin only settings panel that somebody would go in and configure for use with the entire organization. And then, right, that channel picker could then be at like lower levels of the organizational hierarchy, right? Still use that tenant ID that we're storing in the channel data to make those connections for like projects or whatever we wanted to do at like a lower level. That's the idea, correct?
Correct.
Yep. Cool. Okay, that's awesome. Well, that I think that's great, Matt. I appreciate so much the conversation we've had today. Anything else you want to share about the work you put in on TeamsKit here? Like any other benefits that you think it's going to bring to our customers? Any other sort of technical details you want to walk through before we hop off the call about building it?
I think I'll just share some general advice for working with the Microsoft
Okay.
APIs.
Yeah, perfect.
Um, my advice is to just download Postman and just always experiment with making every API call before you use a Microsoft API in production.
Okay.
Don't make any assumptions based on the documentation. You really want to dig into the testing things out yourself because you might discover that the APIs just work differently as expected in your specific scenario.
Okay, I think that's good advice. And maybe before that is like if you're just doing a TeamsKit integration or Teams integration, like let's just use TeamsKit, and then you don't even have then Matt's done all of that headache for you, absorbed
Right.
all of that headache for you. But definitely, yeah, I think that's good advice, sort of regardless, because especially at these larger organizations, the docs don't always match exactly what you might get from the production API. And there's a lot of drift that can happen, I think, at larger teams like that, where the response might change or another team takes it over and forgets, like you said, what was the example you used where there were different names for the entra tenants across the documentation surface? Like, I think
Right.
that stuff's more common than you'd think at these larger, like enterprise focus organizations. Well, awesome, Matt. Thanks so much for having the conversation. We're really excited to get TeamsKit out there and in the hands of our customers. So, to everybody watching at home, thanks for watching and knock on.
Thanks, Jeff.